The final decades of the 19th century saw the city of Paris at the centre of an artistic revolution, the birth of Impressionism. Despite strong early criticism, the paintings of Impressionist artists such as Monet, Renoir and Pissarro would eventually be accepted as amongst the greatest of all time. The same is true of the work of another painter closely associated with the Impressionists, Édouard Manet. Of all the artists of the age, Manet was perhaps the most contradictory of them all. Though regarded as a controversial and rebellious figure, Manet spent his entire working life pursuing conventional fame and fortune. Though closely associated with Monet in particular, Manet was not strictly an Impressionist artist. Perhaps most importantly of all, a painter now accepted as one of the greats was often unsure of his artistic direction and deeply hurt by criticism of his work. Only at the end of his life did Manet achieve the acclaim that his genius deserved. Édouard Manet was born in Paris on the 23rd of January 1832. He was the eldest son of Auguste Manet, a wealthy civil servant, and Eugene Fournier, a diplomat's daughter. His days at school were undistinguished, and he left without the qualifications needed to study law, to the disappointment of his father. Instead, the young Manet twice attempted to secure a place at the French Naval Academy. When this also came to nothing, he decided to turn to art. During his school days, he'd shown a talent for drawing, attending special classes with Antonin Proust, a boy who would become a lifelong friend. Therefore, in 1849, Édouard's wealthy father made available the funds to pay for his son to train as an artist. In January 1850, Manet's student years began.
The classical training for artists at that period, in, say, the 1860s, was studying from the live model. They also went along to the Louvre, where they would study sculptures, classical sculptures mostly, and paintings by the great masters of the past. And they'd learn about techniques as well. They'd learn how to make preliminary drawings, how to transfer these onto the canvas, and it was all a very complicated and very craftsman-like process.
His master was Thomas Couture, an established 35-year-old painter who worked within the academic tradition that dominated French painting at the time. Couture's best-known work, Romans of the Decadence, painted in 1847, was a typical academic painting, a massive, idealized depiction of a scene from ancient history. Its dark tones, smoothness of finish, and intricate details were exactly what was sought by the juries of the Academy, or Salon, the official annual exhibition of French art. So dominant was the Salon that it was virtually impossible for an artist to become successful without his work being accepted for display there. For Manet, success at the Salon would be an obsession throughout his life.
Essentially, the whole point of the teaching was to teach people to produce pictures that were based on classical mythology. And the paintings all had a rather neutral tone. The paintings all had a similarity to them. And it was expected that you conformed to this particular rather rigid style. And this became very much a straitjacket on artists working at the time, because outside of that system, there was really very little scope for one to become a professional artist or to sell one's work.
According to one well-quoted story, the student Manet reacted quickly against the traditions of his master. When Couture's studio models adopted consciously epic, heroic poses in front of him, the young artist asked if they would buy radishes in the market with the same contrived posture. There is no doubt that Manet did argue with Couture during his student days, notably over the use of transitional colour, but their differences of opinion may well have been exaggerated by history. Manet remained with his master for a full 6 years and continued to seek his opinion after striking out on his own. By the end of the 1850s, Manet felt he had completed his artistic training. In addition to his studies with Couture, he also attended the famously liberal Académie Suisse, just as Monet and Renoir did a decade later. He studied the old masters in the Louvre and travelled extensively around Europe to see the greatest old masters for himself, notably in Holland and Italy. In his personal life, he began a relationship with Suzanne Leenhoff, a Dutch piano teacher whose son, Leon, born in 1852, was almost certainly Manet's. By 1858, he was ready to begin his adult career. Using his family money, he rented the first of his own studios and painted his first submission to the Salon, the Absinthe Drinker. Unfortunately for Manet, the painting was rejected by the Salon jury. It would become a recurring experience.
The Absinthe Drinker, when it came out, was absolutely appalled the audience. Manet said that he just painted a scene of modern life, and he couldn't understand why people were so appalled by it. And they were appalled, actually, because it was a picture of low life, so to speak.
He picked a person who was actually the local rag and bone man, and he presented him as a subject for a painting. And here we have this man, you can see him rather, his eyes are in shade. It's like a man whose the light's gone out in him personally. He's a ruined person. And beside him, you see this glass of absinthe. And it seems to hover in space. It's almost like, somebody once said it was like the unholy grail. It's almost more like a mirage. And Couture's tutor, when he saw this painting, said, well, there's only one absinthe drinker here, and that's the person who painted it. And with that, Manet turned and said, I no longer want to paint classical paintings. I want to be a modern contemporary artist, and this is a modern subject.
Despite the failure of his first serious canvas, Manet's family wealth enabled him to carry on painting, and in 1861, he received his first favourable response from the Salon with 2 of his canvases accepted, a portrait of his parents and a picture of a Spanish singer. This was the first of Manet's paintings to display an obvious Spanish influence, at a time when a romanticised view of the Spanish way of life was popular in France. This influence on Manet continued over the following years in canvases such as 1862's Lola de Valence, a light and colourful depiction of a real Spanish dancer. He also painted bullfighting scenes, including one that was accepted by the 1864 Salon. Entitled Episode of a Bullfight, the strong criticism it attracted gives a clear indication of Manet's lifelong sensitivity. Depressed by the reaction, he destroyed virtually the whole canvas. By that time, however, Manet had become well known in Paris's artistic community. In fact, he had become notorious. In no small part, this stemmed from the influence of the French poet and critic Charles Baudelaire. For years, Baudelaire had argued for a new kind of painting, a visual art that would take as its subject matter not the idealized historical scenes favored by the Salon, but real contemporary life. Manet met Baudelaire in 1860, and the 2 men became closely acquainted. Soon, Manet sought to become what his friend memorably termed the painter of modern life. Concert in the Twilowies, a small canvas from 1862, represented his first attempt at this bold new artistic aim.
Baudelaire believed that the artist should portray the heroism of modern life, and that was what Manet was attempting to do in the concert. He focused completely on the haute bourgeoisie. It wasn't classical goddesses and so on. It was quite acceptable in a way because it was this class rather than the working class, say like Courbet painted.
Right actually on the very left-hand side of the painting is Manet himself, almost hidden against one of the trees behind a lady who wears a blue bonnet, is Baudelaire himself. And then you also get people like Edmond Duranty, and you get Fantin Latour, the painter Fantin Latour. So that most of Manet's friends are depicted in the painting. Also, when we see the painting, it has this very modernistic look to it. Curiously, the eye isn't actually set down onto one particular part of the painting. It seems to rather scurry about, picking up on one person and moving to another person, backwards and forth across the painting. And in a sense, that's very like what it would be like to be actually in the park itself.
There's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Perhaps fearful of rejection, Manet chose not to submit Les Twilowies to the 1863 Salon. Instead, he chose to present a far more radical work that demonstrated his new, modern approach. It was another park scene, a canvas 11 feet long and 7 feet high, exactly the kind of proportions favoured by the official show. It would become one of the most controversial paintings ever, Les Déjeuners sur l'herbe, the picnic on the grass. To modern viewers, the storm that this canvas provoked can be difficult to appreciate. It's a painting that displays an obvious debt to a great old master, the concert champêtre of the Renaissance Venetian Giorgione. Manet's use of the nude also followed in a long artistic tradition. The problem was the context of the nudity. It was defiantly contemporary, as the clothing of the two men made abundantly clear. Nudity was acceptable within a historical or mythological scene. To place it in the present day was nothing short of outrageous. Unsurprisingly, the Salon jury rejected the work. However, Les Déjeuners received a full public showing. The Salon jury rejected so many works in 1863 that the Emperor, Napoleon III, famously insisted that all the rejected works should be shown together at a special one-off show at the Salon building. When this Salon des Refusés opened, there was no doubting the most talked-about canvas. Critics and public fell over themselves in a rush to condemn Manet's work. Some chose to criticize technical aspects of the painting, with its rough brushwork commented upon by many. For most people, however, it was the brazen nakedness of the main female figure that placed Manet beyond the pale. His response was to paint an even more audacious image, Olympia. Completed in the same year as Les Déjeuners, Olympia featured much in common with its notorious predecessor. Again, there was the influence of a great Venetian painting, the Venus d'Urbino of Titian. The model used by Manet was Victorine Meurent, the same young woman who had posed for Les Déjeuners, and he once more depicted her in a scandalous state of undress. Even the painting's title seemed calculated to cause outrage. Olympia was a contemporary phrase for a prostitute.
With Olympia, again, he didn't mean to shock. He meant to bring a Renaissance reclining nude of a goddess up to date. The fact that he used quite a well-known courtesan was probably a mistake on his part, because this is what outraged people. The men, for example, didn't want to go round the gallery with their wives on their arms and be confronted with someone that they knew in another world, so to speak.
Surprisingly, the Salon accepted Olympia for display at its 1865 event. Unsurprisingly, it was greeted with a storm of protest. Public and critics again railed against what they considered an image of gross indecency. The Salon authorities were compelled to hang the painting high up on a wall for fear that it would be vandalized. However, the whole event was not a complete disaster for Manet. The 25-year-old Émile Zola wrote newspaper articles praising Manet's approach, opinions that lost him his job after complaints from readers. Manet's notoriety also began to appeal to a small number of radical artists just beginning to make their way in the world, a group led by a young painter from Le Havre, Claude Monet. At the time of the Olympia scandal, however, we know that Manet felt the criticism deeply, but it's difficult to believe that he anticipated a favourable response given the events of 1863. Nonetheless, Manet was depressed by the scandal, leading to scornful response from his friend Baudelaire. "It's really stupid that you should get so worked up," he wrote. "You're laughed at. Your merits are not appreciated. So what? Do you think you're the first man to be in that position?"
His whole emphasis was on importance of the old masters, study in the Louvre and so on, and of wishing to be recognised as part of mainstream salon work. I don't think he disagreed initially with the reaction that he got. On the other hand, it rather frustrated him.
I think when you look at Manet, you can see that he both wanted to make an artistic statement, but at the same time, he wanted to present something that really shocked the public. He was very much a revolutionary artist, a very complex character in himself, and I think a certain sense of becoming notorious was part of his character.
Criticism of Manet's work in the 1860s derived not only from his choice of subject matter. Technical aspects of his work were also condemned.
The way that Manet approached his work was, I suppose, in essence, a development of traditional salon academic work. But he had been concerned with loosening up his brushstrokes paintwork. This was influenced from some of his study of old master works. Plus his interest in light and the way that this had an effect upon the figure.
This was new, but his use of colour was not impressionist yet. He used quite a lot of black, he used green, he wasn't painting outside, so he was doing studio work. And all these early works of the early 1860s are like this.
Manet's distinctive technical approach can be seen in his 1868 portrait of Émile Zola. The vast expanse of black that makes up the writer's jacket is, perhaps, the painting's most dominant feature. But Manet also makes obvious his liking for Japanese prints, placing one beside his own controversial Olympia.
Manet was very much still wedded to a slightly older style of painting. Japanese prints had come into France from around about the middle of the 19th century. And they have an image where one sees very bold statements, very bold colours, very large patterned areas. And this affected almost all of the artists, but one of the artists who it affected most was Edouard Manet, because he could see that it related very much to his way of working, where he liked bold contrasts. He didn't like the kind of half-tone painting that one saw in academic painting. And so that images which allowed him to make pattern-orientated pictures was much more in tune with the way how he worked.
By the late 1860s, Manet was not short of friends. Each evening, he would visit the Café Gerbois near his studios in the Batignolles quarter. There, he became the focal point of a social group that included artists such as Monet, Renoir, Degas, Basile, Pissarro, and Cézanne. These café meetings have become legendary in the history of Impressionism. Although we have no written record of the discussion that took place, it was here that some of the greatest artists of history developed their own unique ideas. These artists were in no doubt about their hero, Édouard Manet. The controversies he'd generated at the Salon had given him the status of a rebel. By breaking with the conventions of academic art, Manet had inspired others to do the same. And at the Café Gerbois, he sat centre stage, his notoriety admired by his younger associates, who became known as Manet's gang.
He didn't want to be a leader of a painting movement. He wanted to follow his own feelings about painting, and he certainly didn't want to be a leader of people like the Impressionists, who were all from a lower class than he was. He actually got on better with Degas, who was an aristocrat and had more in common with him. Manet was something of a dandy, and he lived up to this, in fact. So he was absolutely appalled when he had these argumentative younger men coming and saying he was wonderful. At first, anyway. Later on, of course, he began to learn from them himself.
Perhaps the most striking visual reminder of Manet's importance to his fellow artists is this portrait by Henri Fantin-Latour, entitled A Studio in the Batignolles Quarter. The star of the painting is undoubtedly the painter at work, Manet. Looking on, we can see Monet, Basile, and an almost reverential Renoir. It's important to recall that when this canvas was painted in 1870, the only well-known figure amongst the artists depicted was Manet, even if he was more infamous than famous. But Manet did not consider himself a revolutionary. In the brochure for an 1867 exhibition of his work, it was claimed that he had no pretensions to overthrow an established mode of painting or to establish a new one. Yet the exhibition concerned was a private one-man display of his work, sited near the official Universal Exposition. It was an obvious challenge to the establishment, yet there can be little doubt that establishment success was what Manet truly craved.
For Manet, he wanted success, but I think he wanted the success on his own terms. And occasionally he went some way towards the establishment. But essentially, his attitude was that the establishment should come to him.
Many students of Manet find this contradiction difficult to fathom. Perhaps there was simply a gap between Manet the painter and Manet the man.
This conflict which he seemed to have within himself between wishing to be accepted and not accepted, I think stems from his family background. Respectable middle class with careers in respectable jobs like banking and law. One felt all the time that at the very bottom that's what he would really like to be. But the fates were against him at times, and his own emotions at times led him astray. I don't think Manet would ever be happy. I think Manet was a somewhat unhappy figure all his life. This is my own feeling about him. I think there was always, if he went one way, he had a nagging suspicion he should be going the other way, and so on. I felt he was never quite at ease with himself.
Politically, Manet's opinions were well known. From childhood onwards, he was a left-wing Republican, opposed to the Second Empire. In 1867, he painted his most overtly political work, The Execution of the Emperor Maximilian. It was an event very much in the news. The French emperor had installed Maximilian, an Austrian nobleman, as Emperor of Mexico, only to abandon him to enemy forces. To depict Maximilian's death by firing squad, Manet borrowed heavily from Goya's 3rd of May, but incorporated his own unconventional approach to perspective. This approach can also be seen in The Balcony, a canvas from 1869 that again shows Goya's influence. But The Balcony is a significant work in its own right. Perhaps unknown to himself, he was making discoveries about the representation of 3 dimensions on a flat surface.
The obvious thing is the balcony, the iron balcony, which cuts right across the central picture. This is dead against all the teaching upon perspective, proportion and the like. He doesn't have to indulge in all sorts of tricks and illusions of perspective. We recognise it as being people behind an iron front to a veranda. The background, likewise, is not recession of colour. It's a dark area against which the figures are, in flat areas of colour, are silhouetted. So you have the silhouettes of figures which are against a dark background, which therefore pushes them forward, and yet are behind this green balcony, iron balcony, which therefore pushes it into the sort of middle space.
The balcony also gives an indication of Manet's personal life at the time. The woman in the foreground is Berthe Morisot, an artist who would later become a key member of the Impressionist school. Although Manet had married Suzanne Lienhoff in 1863, there is no doubt that Manet and Morisot possessed strong feelings for each other, although the physical nature of their relationship is uncertain. Manet executed many portraits of Morisot, and a physical affair with her would not have been out of character. He was well known for turning his models into his mistresses. One such young woman was Eva Gonzalez, who began to sit for Manet in 1869, and whose closeness to the artist was a source of concern to Berthe Morisot. However, this 1870 portrait of Eva perhaps fails to capture any feelings the artist had towards his model. In July 1870, Manet and his fellow Parisians were faced with problems far greater than those of art. The outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. Different artists reacted in different ways to the news. Manet, like Degas, enlisted as a gunner in Paris. Basile's decision to fight cost him his life, while Renoir took a safe posting in the south, and Monet famously fled to London. After the war and the horrors of the Paris Commune, artistic life returned, subtly different from before. Significantly, Claude Monet stopped submitting paintings to the Salon. Having already pioneered the Impressionist approach to light and colour with his paintings of 1869 and 1870, he and many of his fellow artists now began to grow frustrated with Salon rejections. They grew convinced of the merits of putting on their own independent exhibition. Eventually, in 1874, the first such show opened and was quickly christened the Impressionist Exhibition. It featured the work of Monet, Renoir, Berthe Morisot, Degas, Cézanne and Pissarro. It did not feature work by Édouard Manet. Despite being perceived by the public as the leader of this new breed of artists, Manet refused to exhibit with them. His loyalties remained wholly with the Salon. This was perhaps understandable. In the early 1870s, Manet's art seemed to be paying dividends for him. In 1872, he sold 28 of his canvases for over 50,000 francs to the dealer Paul Durand-Royal, the best-known collector of Impressionist work. The following year, he sold 15 works to a wealthy opera star for 20,000 francs. That same year, he achieved genuine acclaim at the Salon with Le Bon Bock, a cheerful image influenced by the great Dutch portraitist Frans Hals. But Le Bon Bock can hardly be considered one of Manet's most significant works. It's a painting designed purely to appeal to the taste of the Salon jury, which it did.
The Bon Bock painting was a little bit of a cause for debate, if you like, within the Impressionist group. Of all of the paintings that Manet did, it was the one which most appealed to the Salon mentality. He hadn't really painted a kind of robust painting that he should be doing. But he'd actually said to his friends, why exhibit independently? Can't you see that I'm in on the inside? So that it was partly he felt that he was beginning to win over the Salon to his own ideas, and that therefore he, in the process, should be able to bring the other Impressionists with him.
It is an irony typical of Manet that in the same year he chose not to exhibit with Monet and the Impressionists, he worked extensively with Monet and painted the most impressionist images of his career. The summer of 1874 saw Manet stay with his friend at the boating resort of Argenteuil on the River Seine. There, he adopted the open-air approach of his younger colleague. This is Manet's famous image of Monet at work on his floating studio boat. It's interesting to compare this work with The Balcony from 5 years before. In the earlier work, facial detail was lacking. Here, it is almost non-existent, a typically Impressionist approach, most emphatic in the depiction of Monet's wife, Camille. Despite this, Manet never completely eliminated detail from the human figure. He was never an open-air landscape artist like Monet. But boating, also from 1874, provides a further striking example of Manet's own brand of Impressionism. Perhaps the greatest of Manet's paintings that summer was Argenteuil, a depiction of a man and woman visiting the riverside resort. It is an undeniably Impressionist work, with the artist deploying a far lighter palette to capture the light of an open-air scene just as effectively as Monet.
I think it was almost like a relaxation. He could sit outside and paint gardens and so on. And because he'd become associated with the other artists, Monet and Renoir and people like that, then he adopted their technique to a certain extent. Even so, though, he always remained slightly detached from them, so that his Impressionism was only, if you like, up to a point. He never actually went as far as the other artists.
I think we've always got to remember, when we're talking about Manet and the Impressionists, is that Manet himself is not really an Impressionist. It was in some of the works of Manet that the clues were given to people like Monet and Renoir as to the way forward for them. But the majority of his work is this struggle between him emerging from very much a classical past, training and interest, and these new ideas which were taken up and indeed enthusiastically fostered by these other artists.
The year after his summer with Monet, Manet visited Venice, where he painted the famous Grand Canal, a vibrant image with choppy, Impressionist brushwork and a shimmering sense of light. The Grand Canal represents the conclusion of Manet's most Impressionist period. It's possible that his ongoing sensitivity played a part in this. Although he must have been aware of the condemnation of the Impressionist exhibition the year before, in 1875 he submitted L'Argenteuil to the Salon. Though it was accepted, it was almost laughed at. "The master is at the stage of a student of 20, wrote one critic. Having submitted so blatantly to salon taste with Le Bon Bock 2 years before, Manet felt the full wrath of the guardians of orthodoxy. Again, the criticism hurt. In many ways, 1876 was even worse for Manet. The Salon rejected both his submissions, and though the artist responded by holding a one-man show in his own studio, he appears to have been profoundly disillusioned. His work rate dropped, and his only significant canvas that year was this portrait of Mallarme, a well-known poet who vociferously supported the Impressionists. Soon, however, Manet's artistic difficulties would be gravely overshadowed. In 1876, he began to feel pains in his left foot. He dismissed it as rheumatism, even when he began to limp badly. It wasn't. It was locomotor ataxia, a disorder of the nervous system closely related to syphilis. It was also incurable and eventually fatal. Though only in his mid-40s, Manet realized that his final years were upon him. His reaction was to increase his output, and for subject matter, he turned time and again to the characters and places of the city, with Paris's cafes and bars providing his greatest inspiration. Canvases such as 1877's The Plum and 1879's Waitress Serving Beer are typical of the period, with the artist making clear once again his love of humanity. Cafe scenes such as these were not unusual. Degas' Absinthe from 1876 is a memorable example of the genre. But whereas Degas appears to hint at a moral message, a canvas like Manet's Inside the Café concentrates on expressing the vitality and humanity of the café, that most famous of Parisian meeting places.
In his café paintings, I believe Manet was trying to paint a scene of everyday life, in fact, and he changed from working outside, like in the Tuileries gardens, to doing actually impressionist work, like more like Degas, in fact, where he was working inside a cafe.
Despite the increasing seriousness of his illness, Manet continued to pursue the mainstream success that had always eluded him. In 1879, he wrote to the prefect of Paris, offering to paint 2 large murals for the new city hall. He received no reply. The following summer, he underwent months of hydrotherapy treatment away from Paris at Bellevue. Though profoundly bored, he continued to paint. Still lifes, landscape, and this timeless canvas showing his elderly mother in the garden of his country retreat. But his health was now failing badly, and the success he had always craved seemed to have eluded him. But the ironies of Manet's life were not yet complete. For the 1881 Salon, he submitted Portrait of Henri Rochefort, a canvas depicting a well-known contemporary event, the escape of a commune leader from his prison on a French Pacific colony. Like the execution of Maximilian, this was an overtly political piece of work, whose anti-government message was obvious at the time. However, the Salon had now changed its structure. It was now under the control of a committee of artists, not the French state, and this worked to Manet's advantage. Whereas he could not even exhibit his first political masterpiece, the portrait of Rochefort was not only accepted by the Salon, but awarded a medal. This meant that Manet could now show his work there every year without fear of rejection by the jury. At last, He was the established artist he had always wanted to be.
Manet, towards the end of his life, through some serious illness, one feels that a certain sense of enthusiasm went out of him. On the other hand, he'd got a body of work, he'd got a pattern of work, he'd got a body of followers, and I think he rather sat back and instead of trying to go forward and experiment again, he was actually consolidating the work that he'd been doing. Meanwhile, taste had rather gone on as well. He had, in fact, influenced the salon so that they were looking at different work now, looser work and so on. And I think that the combination of those things meant that he, in a sense, compromised. I think that he ceased to push forward the boundaries. Meanwhile, the salon had begun to accept new ideas. And he enjoyed the recognition which they gave him. He had a medal and all sorts of honours. And I think that was something which he perhaps rather enjoyed when the rest of life was being somewhat disappointing.
Better was to come. In 1881, he was awarded the Legion of Honour. His old friend, Antonin Proust, had become government minister for the arts and used his influence to secure this ultimate in official recognition. Unfortunately, Manet would not be able to enjoy for long his newfound acclaim. He had less than 18 months to live. But in that time, he summoned his artistic efforts one last time to create the painting that remains his last and greatest masterpiece, the bar at the Folly Berger. For his final great work, Manet returned to the vibrant world of the Parisian café, although the famous Folly Berger was more than just a café. Its circus performers were also a strong part of its attraction. Manet began the painting by making studies on the premises, but his illness meant that the canvas was executed in the studio, where the model stood behind a bar constructed for the purpose. By early 1882, Manet had defied his increasing disability and completed his masterpiece. It is a painting whose appeal is perhaps difficult to pin down. Having said that, there are few students who deny this one painting its status as one of the greatest images of 19th century art.
To many people, the bar at the Folly Berger is regarded as perhaps his best work. I'm not certain that it is necessarily one of his best. It certainly seems to bring together a number of the things with which he had been tackling throughout his life, and which other artists like Monet and Renoir and Degas and all sorts of others were also taking on.
The thing about it was that it actually provoked just as much criticism, just as much scandal at the time as some of his earlier paintings. And the reason for it is rather hidden now, but we can actually unravel it if we look at the painting.
The bar at the Folly Berger shows a young woman facing us leaning on a bar. In the background, until you look quite closely, you don't really know what's happening because there is a mirror there. So he put this mirror there to reflect what was going on in the rest of the room so that we could see it. But it puts the young woman in a rather ambiguous position in between two different realities, really.
Now, because we're looking straight at her, and she's looking straight back at us, then her reflection would be directly behind her. But if we look at this painting, her reflection isn't actually directly behind her, it's off to the right. And the painting is actually two viewpoints worked together. And the reason why her reflection is set off to the right is for the other person in the painting. Because right at the very right-hand edge of the painting, we see a man dressed in a frock coat with a top hat.
There is some evidence to suggest that barmaids at the time were on a very meagre wage and could supplement their income by giving sexual favours to some clients. And therefore, in that interpretation, the person that we see with the top hat and dressed formally, is a patron not simply for buying the alcohol, but for buying sexual favours as well.
She is talking to a well-dressed man about town, the kind of person who would go to the salon to see the paintings. What Manet is saying is that you, the viewer, you, the person who looks at this painting, you, the person who's goes to the salon, who's a member of the upper middle class, you go to this girl on your afternoons off, shall we say, for a completely different agenda. And this created enormous scandal in the 1880s. I don't know that you could say that the Folly Berger was specifically his masterpiece, but I think that you could say that it was his final statement.
Manet attended the 1882 Salon, where Bar at the Folly Berger was an overwhelming success, but he was now a dying man. The following winter, the end drew near. On the 20th of April 1883, he underwent the amputation of a gangrenous leg, but the operation failed to benefit the stricken artist. 10 days later, on the 30th of April, Édouard Manet died. He was 51. In his life, he had at last achieved the success he craved.
For a lot of the time that he worked, he was rather shut out from the salon. He was almost branded as a heretic. And it was only towards the end of his life that he became accepted. Even so, despite that fact, I don't think his ideas changed at all. And some of his paintings, even at the end of his life, were just as rebellious, if you like, or provoked just as much reaction as some of the paintings that he did at the beginning of his life. So I think that Manet relished the idea of being the leader of the avant-garde movement.
In the century that followed, the true value of his work became appreciated across the world. The inspiration he gave to the Impressionists alone makes Édouard Manet one of the greatest figures in the history of art.